Great. Well, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Nelson. We are so excited to have you here and talk about a topic that, as we, as a advocacy organization, move forward and work with a lot of different folks in a variety of stages of potential therapeutic advancements for neonatal HIE. Thought that this topic was incredibly important to bring to not only our families who are interested in and have participated in research and will participate in research, but also for those that we work with, because I first had the opportunity recently to hear a presentation that you gave at the International Neonatal Consortium meeting about neonatal trials and ethics. And I just thought this topic was so important to elevate more, especially to our greater community. And so I'm first and foremost, thank you for joining us. I'm really excited.
My pleasure.
And I'd love for you to give a little bit of your background and introduction to our community.
Sure. So, currently I'm working for Johnson & Johnson doing pediatric drug development, but that in some sense is my third career. I started off life doing clinical work. My interest in ethics was started in medical school. I did a Master of Divinity degree when I was in medical school, and then decided to do a Ph.D. in the study of religion focusing on ethics. Took me a while to do that. I finished the dissertation while I was doing my fellowship training and on faculty. I did my clinical training in pediatrics, but then I was interested in the intensive care unit. So I ended up, I won't go into how this happened, but I ended up doing both a neonatal and a pediatric intensive care fellowship. So I was boarded in both. I then took a position primarily in the pediatric ICU, but then moved to Milwaukee, where I was at the Children's Hospital of Wisconsin and was medical director of their NICU in the early 1990s, but then focused primarily on pediatric intensive care. During my time in Milwaukee, I became chair of the Institutional Review Board, which is it's the board that reviews the protocols. And then I moved to Children's Hospital Philadelphia also to be chair of the IRB and to continue work in the pediatric intensive care unit. So I focused my ethical interest in research ethics. And out of that, basically I was recruited to go to the FDA because the FDA has a position in pediatric research ethics, which is part of the legislation stimulating pediatric research. So I took that position, was in it for about 10 years. And to summarize it, most of the ethical issues that we would consult on are around risk and benefit. And once you do that for 10 years, become very good at drug development. And that's why I was then recruited to Johnson & Johnson to do drug development. Though everything we're talking about here is mainly based on my work at the FDA and my work prior to that as an IRB chair. So that's sort of how it all happened. It's sort of three careers: the sort of academic career, then the regulatory career, and now the industry career. I'll stop there and see if you want to pursue any of that, or we can get into some of the neonatal ethical issues.
Yeah, so that's just such an incredibly diverse and well-rounded lens to come at this, because I think so many people in the landscape have perhaps one of those lenses, right?
Yep.
And so I think, what I was most excited to bring to our community is that I, as the executive director of the organization, am privy to a lot of conversations and presentations in a lot of the discussions that happen when developing these clinical trials and when talking about, how these are done and what ethical considerations go into place for a lot of this work. And I think it's just important to come at this with our community of the why, and we have a lot of families, again, that have historically participated. We have families that were in the original cooling trials from all around the world. And then we also have families that, have been a part of every landmark study since then. And then those that are being enrolled right now in all sorts of additional studies and those that are to come. And there are some things that I really thought were worth exploring today to talk through where, there
Sure.
are many different difficult things with neonatal clinical trials in particular and pediatrics. And a lot of that is I think, our want and need to protect the most fragile babies who are the most vulnerable in a medical situation. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit kind of about what you've seen in the historical context of neonatal clinical trials, of ethics, with, anything from, a lot of these babies that end up in the NICU have to be
Right.
resuscitated. And so there's a lot of, there's trials going on about resuscitation protocols. And when we talk about consent and ethics and things like that of doing research in babies, I'd just love for you to give a little bit of more of that background of where we've been and where you've seen it go, and where, maybe some of the barriers that still exist are.
Sure. Yeah. So one way of summarizing kind of the trajectory of pediatric clinical research is that we started off sort of in the 1970s and 80s because there were a lot of there were reasons why we needed to put into place ethical protections. The way that was interpreted, and I can talk a little bit about those protections, but the way that ended up being interpreted was you should protect vulnerable populations, particularly children, from research, that somehow research was what you needed to protect them from, as opposed to, I think, a more current understanding is you protect children through research and through appropriate research. That if you're not doing research, basically there's not much of a database on which clinicians can make their decisions about what works and what doesn't work. And so particularly in neonatal intensive care, you see a lot of off-label prescribing without a clear understanding of the appropriate dose, the duration, et cetera, whether it works or doesn't work. And that's just reflects the fact that there's very little data behind many of the interventions that are done in the neonatal intensive care unit. Not all, but many. And so the idea is that appropriately designed research needs to be conducted. And when I say appropriately designed, there are ethical guidelines for what a pediatric research protocol ought to look like. And if you set aside minimal risk stuff like a single blood draw, it basically argues and says that the Research Ethics Committee, the IRB, needs to decide that the risks are reasonable in association with the potential clinical benefit, and that balance of risk and benefit is comparable to the available alternatives. And so the idea is that a baby shouldn't be disadvantaged by being in a research protocol. That being in that protocol has a comparable risk benefit to receiving something outside of that protocol. Now, it's a judgment call, and it's complicated as to whether or not any given protocol meets that, but that's the general requirements. So I think hopefully one could be assured that an appropriately designed protocol would be, if someone chose to enter it, gave consent to enter it, an appropriate thing to do. So I think at this point we understand that we can't protect children from research. It's really through research, through appropriately designed and ethically conducted research, that we should be able to protect children. Now, switching to the neonatal side of things, there's not a lot of studies that have gone on because there's not a lot of product development, unfortunately, in neonatal. You mentioned hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy and cooling. I mean, that's a very important area. There's a lot of research going on in that area. I happened to actually, before I went to the FDA, I was on the Center for Devices panel that reviewed the neonatal cool cap. So I had an opportunity to vote on whether that should be approved. I voted yes, just as an aside, because I thought that it was a fairly low risk intervention. Now, there's a lot of whole body, there's a lot of other research that's going on, but I think that was an important advance. But there had been neonatal research. If you look at surfactant is one of the success areas, and that started in the early 1980s, and with multiple different surfactant trials. So that is definitely a success story, and parents-to-be had to agree to put their preterm infant into that trial. And so the question is, what does that look like? I think one of the differences as we think about the consent process, and when I'm going to use consent, but strictly speaking, I should talk about parental permission to expose the infant to the risk of the intervention. We give permission for others. We don't consent for others. I mean, but consent is such we use it so much. It's, I'm going to use it just because it's easier.
Sure.
So if you think about it, surfactant is for preterm birth. And so if you come into the hospital and there's a risk of preterm birth, there's some time to have that conversation prior to birth. Now, there might not be. It could be urgent. It could be within minutes. It could be within a half an hour. There might not be time, and that infant wouldn't have been enrolled in a surfactant trial. But often there could be hours as that delivery is progressing, and whether it goes to a vaginal delivery or cesarean section, there could be hours for the neonatologist to have that conversation with the pregnant person, as well as partner, if available, to talk about administration of surfactant at birth. So there's time to be able to do that. One of the challenges in the area of perinatal asphyxia is once that risk is recognized, the delivery occurs as urgently as possible. And so it's not as if in that window of time, there can be a meaningful conversation, let's say, about an intervention that might occur after birth. I mean, it's a very different sort of landscape. And because of that, for example, in the neonatal cool cap study, I believe that they had a window of getting consent of 4 hours. And so within 4 hours after birth, you could have that conversation. There's been perinatal asphyxia, a concern for possible HIE and a desire to minimize that. And so 4 hours was chosen as the period of time to have that conversation. Now, one could debate whether that's the right, time to do that intervention. And one thing I had talked about is we had done a study that was published now 20 years ago when I looked at it back in 2004, looking at the views of parents, nurses, clinicians around cooling after a cardiac arrest in the pediatric intensive care unit. The therapeutic window that was defined was the researchers felt that they should start cooling within 30 minutes. And so the question came down to whether or not within 30 minutes you could have a meaningful conversation to get consent to start cooling. Many reasons. Sometimes the parents are not even at the bedside. They may not even be at the hospital. I mean, there's a number of reasons why that would present a lot of difficulties, not the least of which is what can you communicate within a half an hour after the stress and surprise of a cardiac arrest that was not anticipated. That project was done under something that's called the exception from informed consent. And what that means is, are there circumstances under which one could only conduct the research in an emergency setting when there's inadequate time to get informed consent? We can, I guess, talk about that exception from informed consent, but perhaps we want to, take a step back and talk about informed consent in general before we do that. Talk about the exception. Maybe we should talk about, informed consent, what that looks like, views towards that first. But I'll stop there and see which direction you want me to go there.
Yeah, there's a couple things that come to mind. So first, we do have families who have like acquired events, so anoxic, or, because there is just no support or very little support for them. So they're in our community as well. And so I think it's interesting for them to hear about trials that have been done for cooling, because that's a question that comes up often of like, why aren't kids cooled, that have like acquired injury later on in childhood outside the neonatal period. And so that's just one thing that, I thought was an interesting perspective when I first heard you speak, to bring that up. And then talking through that, the different forms of consent and why, I think out there, most people have heard of informed consent and consenting in, and, even when, you go into the hospital and you're, writing down for consent to treat. Right. And so I would love to start there of, what the, I guess, the philosophy is behind that, and why we do those things, and why the forms are 20 pages long, and some of the,
That's right. All right, well, let's
issues there.
Yes, they're long, and 20 pages could well be a short one.
Right.
So yeah, let's just talk about informed consent in general. And so the idea behind consent is that it's both informed and voluntary. And a little bit about the voluntary aspect. The first thing about voluntary is that it's not unduly influenced or coerced. Now, coercion means threat of harm. So I don't think we're really in a situation where we're talking about a threat of harm, but an example might be if you go in to see your own physician and that physician says something like, I'm an investigator in a research protocol, and unless you consent, I'm not going to take care of you anymore. That's clearly coercive. Now, I don't know of anybody I've never seen anybody say that, but the point is that's clearly coercive. You fear harm to yourself because of the loss of that therapeutic relationship. Now, there could be others, but that would be coercive. So you can't have coercive. Undue influence is a little bit more fuzzy about what that means. So, for example, is it unduly influential to pay someone to go into research? Well, I mean, I get paid to do my job. I mean, do I think I'm unduly influenced by that? No. I mean, in fact, if they didn't pay me, I might be doing something else. So it's a complicated question about what is undue influence. And one of the questions that might come up is, if you're in a situation of crisis, how much is that crisis unduly influential? I mean, can you make a decision under that moment of crisis? Now, I've heard different sort of decision-making theorists talk about both sides of that. Some people would say, well, no, absolutely not. I mean, that situation means you can't really make a voluntary choice, because you are, there is no choice. And you may hear parents say something like, there's no other choice that I could make. That is the only choice I could make. Now, does that mean it's any less voluntary? I would argue no. I mean, that's just simply saying it's the only choice that makes sense.
Right.
So there's not, so I personally don't think that informed consent, that the voluntary aspect of consent is undermined by that crisis moment. But it does require then a fair amount of skill, I guess, on the part of the individual obtaining the consent, to be aware of that and to adapt the process to what's going on at the moment, because it may be very different. And that's, I think, one of the challenges. We don't talk about the consent form, we talk about the process. One of the challenges is, how much do you really know what's happening? Do you know the individual who's doing it? I mean, if this is a skilled neonatal clinician, it doesn't matter if it's a nurse practitioner, physician assistant, or a pediatrician, but if this is a skilled neonatal clinician, I mean, you could have much more confidence that process will be reasonable, as opposed to you've hired yourself a research coordinator who comes in, presents the form, and just reads it.
Right.
And I've seen both of those approaches, and they're very different. On the informed side, then the interesting question is, well, how much do you need to know? And if you look, I mean, the FDA does have guidance, and I'll just mention it has guidance on the exception from informed consent, which came out in 2013. It has guidance on informed consent, which came out in 2023. To give you an idea, it's 60 pages long. I mean, it's got a lot of details in there. And then it has a guidance that's called sort of key information that came out recently in March of 2024. The idea behind key information is, can you improve the quality of the understanding? Can you improve what people understand by presenting the key information in a way that's much more easily digestible and easily understood? Not a lot of data on how well that works, but that's the idea.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with it is it doesn't say that you can get consent by only presenting the key information. You still have to present all of the other stuff. And if you think about it, I mean, there are, a key information might be, let's say, common adverse events or rare but serious adverse events. In other words, as opposed to just all the adverse events that might occur. The challenge is if you leave something out of the consent process. Most of us think we are reasonable decision makers. And what happens if that adverse event that you left out happens? We, the natural tendency would be for us to then blame the fact that we weren't told. Even if we might not have made a different decision, we would have made the same decision even if we were told. But we weren't told. And so, it gets very complex. So the difficulty with the key information approach is it doesn't say you don't have to present the rest. It tries to improve the understanding, but then still says you can't say you've gotten valid informed consent until all the rest had been presented. So even if the key information, let's say, is 2 pages, but the rest of the form is 25, you still have to do the rest of the 25 before you get to the end of the process.
Right.
So that goes back to time. And this is a way for me maybe to talk about that study that we did.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So the question was, and we did focus groups with parents who had children in the intensive care unit. We did focus groups with parents who had had children who had had a cardiac arrest, some of whom were successfully resuscitated, some of whom were not. We also did focus groups with nurses and clinicians, as well as hospital administrators, because this was an in-hospital proposal. A large part of what had to be discussed, particularly with parents, is their first reaction was, well, of course I want to know what's going on and I want to give consent. And so what we had to do is make a distinction between what it is you accomplish in that first 30 minutes versus what has to happen for the FDA or for an IRB to say that consent has been obtained, which is in some sense reflects this distinction between key information and then the rest of the 25-page form. And so the idea was you could potentially present in that first half an hour, assuming availability of the parent, the really high-level key information to where one could not so much get consent, because you still need the other 25 pages in the rest of the time, but at least to allow that parent the opportunity to say no. No, I don't want to, or yes, go ahead. And then the cooling could start, but you're not like immediately cooled. I mean, the cooling starts and it takes time. So the process then continues, but you can't start until you have consent, and you can't get consent until you finish that process. And so the concept here was that to make a distinction between the communication that occurs around that in that first half an hour versus then the consent process for the remainder of the time. And if you look at the exception from informed consent regulations, it basically says, A, it has to be life-threatening. Now, that doesn't mean that life per se is at risk. Life-threatening could also mean serious morbidity. So I don't want people to think that it means you're going to die. Serious morbidity in terms of seizures and developmental delay, et cetera, that would also be included under life-threatening. The intervention has to offer the potential for benefit. And existing interventions have to be either unproven or unsatisfactory. And so if you think about unproven or unsatisfactory, the FDA would think it's unproven if it's not labeled. An academic investigator might think if they did a great study and published it, that it's proven, even if it's not labeled. So there's a bit of a judgment call there. Unsatisfactory is phenobarbital, which is approved for neonatal seizures, I believe, probably because it's just so old. No one thought to divide out the neonates, and the label doesn't say anything about age. Is that satisfactory? I think most people would say, well, no, that's not satisfactory. So, as a treatment, so there's a judgment call there. But if those conditions exist, you then do a community consultation and public disclosure, which is that focus group process that I described, but that could be done different ways. And then you need to offer parents the opt-out option. And then if that parent's not available, and you have to make every effort during that therapeutic window, which in this case we defined as 30 minutes, but it could be an hour, or you could define it depending on the science and the clinical circumstance. You have to make every effort to reach the parent so that they could say no. Not that they would give consent in that moment, but at least they could say, no, I don't want to. And ideally, if you're doing this kind of research, people know about it. I mean, it's not as if it's private and it wouldn't be a surprise to a parent, but it could be. So all of those things go together to where one would then say we could proceed, let's say in that cooling, which could we then start cooling at 30 minutes? We couldn't find the parents, and then they have an opportunity. They could always come in an hour later and say stop, because you still need to get consent when they arrive, et cetera. So that's the exception from informed consent. And one of the questions, and this was, I think, what initiated the conversation at the International Neonatal Consortium, is can that be used? What are the circumstances under which that could be used, and what are the challenges in using that? And I will say a lot of researchers think that that's a highly challenging paradigm to apply and to use. But the purpose of at least our article 20 years ago was we didn't think it was that challenging, at least for in-hospital studies as opposed to out of hospital. There was a trial done of seizure treatment in out of hospital patients, which used the exception from informed consent. But that, it was fairly complicated to do that. Fairly complicated to do that. I'll stop there and see where you want to take that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, really helpful. Just for people that are tuning in, especially to see the complexity that goes into all of this planning and all the decision making. Like that's well before you even get to a trial. So,
oh yeah, absolutely.
Because I think there's just a lot of perception that, and misperceptions out there, which is why we do these, of what that process looks like and why, right? The why behind things. And so, I think that was a really great overview of, consenting and things like that. I want to talk a little bit about, pendulum swings, and where I'm going with that is, in the context of neonatal clinical trials right now, and like a lot of the conversation, I know that when you presented, it was to the neonatal seizure group at INC. And, I sit on the neonatal seizure registry parent work group, for a large, multi-year, multi-arm now studies of, in neonatal seizures. And then looking at, how things are going with current HIE trials. So they're looking at cooling for mild babies and novel therapeutics and things like that. And my observations have been really interesting to be privy to, again, a lot of these meetings as a parent and a science adjacent human and not necessarily a scientist. But looking at, where I think we see the intention of consent and ethics and, all of these approvals. And then sometimes, in your words, really, of like talking about, what research is meant to do with neonates and from research, but protect them in research. And we see a lot of people as well, especially in the HIE space, that want to protect infants from research, which I see as a barrier to advancing potential therapeutics in the space, especially when it comes to novel therapeutics or repurposed drugs. And my concern always from the advocacy side is we do today in 2024 have one therapeutic intervention for HIE, and it helps a lot of babies, but it does not help everyone. And it's a resource dependent intervention. And so when we look at, have you seen any of that? Have you seen because that's a lot of the barriers that I see currently play out is well, we have cooling, so we're a little nervous to try anything else, and what barriers, there's families that aren't even getting approached that qualify for certain things because of the inherent bias, perhaps, of the team that is working with these, and a lot of the feedback has been that I've heard, candid feedback has been, families are already going through so much. We don't want to add something else to their burden. And so that perspective concerns me greatly. And I wanted to get you as an ethicist, your feedback a little bit on that as well.
Well, you've raised a number of different issues, and let me perhaps divide out two, because initially you started, and I was beginning to think about trust. You started about talking about the perspective of parents. You have a vulnerable neonate, and I think the instinct is to protect, and layer onto that perhaps a lack of trust, building up that trust, I think, is important. And I would imagine part of the challenge, particularly in HIE, is no one. It's not like you go in to deliver a baby and think that that's going to happen to you, which is very different than other areas where patient advocacy is very important, genetic diseases, things like Duchenne muscular dystrophy. You've got it, you know it, and it's there, and then you can say, okay, what do I do with it? It's not like someone comes into the hospital to deliver a baby and I assume the people in your group maybe are, because they've had that experience, they didn't think when they went into it. So it's
I would
a challenge.
Say 99.9% are not anticipating you get to a certain point in your pregnancy and you think that you're doing really well, and the majority, have something, that is great until it's not.
Right. Exactly. So how do you, I guess to me that goes to how do you mobilize advocacy?
Yeah.
Because I do think, and having seen it at the FDA, I do think that advocacy groups can have a major impact on regulatory decision making.
Right.
But it's a challenge in this case. So, in building up advocacy, now, in a way that a parent totally, suddenly realizes they're now in this situation, having not anticipated it, not expected it, not wished for it or whatever, and suddenly you're now presented with a baby with hypoxic injury, with or without seizures. What do you do? And building that trust. Sometimes units have that trust. So it's a complicated area. Not only that, we could have a much broader conversation about the trust to science within our society at large. It's right. Which is a bigger problem. Now, I don't have any easy solutions other than to continue to advocate, and have institutions perhaps try to build up that trust within the community, so that when someone comes and asks about a research project, it's not, the immediate reaction is no, go away. I'm not saying everybody should consent to it. You've got to listen to it, but you hope you don't necessarily just have that visceral reaction against research, which hopefully wouldn't be an issue. I would be a little bit more concerned about clinicians who are not supportive. And that can be complex. I mean, neonatal intensive care has, as I said, a long history of interventions that are off-label, that have not been studied, et cetera. And in spite of that, clinicians have a wide variety of opinions about whether something works or not. And they wouldn't be doing it unless they think it works. And if they truly believe it works, they may or may not be that interested in participating in a study. So there's a point at which you need to convince the clinicians involved that there's sufficient uncertainty in what they believe to be true that an actual study is required. You know, that's a general problem in pediatric medicine. I'm going to just say it's not just unique to neonatal intensive care units, that clinicians can feel strongly about what they're doing, even if the evidence-based, whether it's FDA approval or published trials that are considered adequate. You know, I don't want to say that the only evidence you need is an FDA label. I mean, that's sort of the gold standard, but you know, if you have that, great. But if you don't, and you have a publication, that's great too. But you know, a lot of people think it works. I know it works, and have never really adequately studied. That's something I think where you really just need to build a culture of research. And I would argue that building that kind of a culture within a unit actually elevates the overall care in that unit, even for those that are not in research. And there's some actually interesting data that showed that the control group often in some trials does better than those that have not been enrolled in the research. You know, so, you know, whether that's being paid more close attention to, I don't want to imply that the care of the others is poor. But and this is not true of all studies, but there's some evidence to suggest that even if you're randomized to not receive the intervention, you might be better off being in that protocol than not.
Yeah, and we see that, I know, a lot with the developmental follow-through, right? So those babies that are enrolled, whether they're receiving intervention or not. And I think, you know, it's interesting to see what will play out with like the Cool Prime trial, which is the mild HIE and cooling, because some sites are not cooling sites and some are. And yet the follow-up protocol is the same. And that's been kind of the discussion is your baby will be extra, you know, like followed extra closely. So if there's something that is happening, you know, regardless of treatment, initially, you'll have that access that you might not have had otherwise. And especially when we talk about like the mild population, that typically it is a much wider gap of consistency of who gets follow-up care or not, because they weren't a part of the original cooling trials and, you know, things like that. And the assumption was that they were did not have any impact later on. So it's, you know, there's all sorts of things that are, you know, I've read that, and it's interesting that is definitely in the conversations in that end of things as well.
Right. And I would hope, I don't know if it's true of the trials that you're aware of, I would hope that that the developmental data that's generated is provided in real time back to parents, you know, because that would be very helpful. To know. Now, the predictability, I mean, I don't know what the follow-up is. I mean, the FDA requires 2 years follow-up using a Bailey. You know, the correlation of a 2-year follow-up to what's going to happen entering high school,
not so good.
You know,
not great.
Now, but one could argue, it's not great, but one could argue that part of the reason why 2 years may be sufficient is what you're really interested in evaluating. And this is why a controlled trial is important. You're really interested in evaluating what the impact of the intervention at birth is. And, you know, from 2 years on, there's so much, you know, it gets into the nature versus nurture. I mean, there's so many variables happening after 2 years that's going to influence, you know, when you graduate and go into high school, that you really can't blame the intervention one way or the other for that. Now, but, you know, I would also say, I mean, when I did my neonatal fellowship, they basically said, you know, 8 years is when they would love. I mean, that was when neonatal follow-up was done by a lot of NICUs. And what happened is that the funding for that, payers decided we don't want to pay for it. And so there's very few NICUs, to my knowledge, although I'm a bit out of date at this point, that are doing just standard neonatal follow-up. So the only way to get those data is to get it inside a research
Absolutely.
study.
And the good news is, I think we're seeing a lot of funding agencies now seeing the value of extending the trial and the developmental trajectory and the developmental tracking, which is very helpful. There's a lot of new data points that are coming out that I think are going to be very influential on continuing that, especially in our, in our neck of the woods with HIE.
Right.
For sure. Well, great conversation. I appreciate all of these topics, and your insights on them so much. We have a couple of comments. I know one of them is from one of our parents who has been a part of several different clinical trials, and she is also one of our peer support mentors who helps a lot of families kind of figure out, these pathways as well, and looking at, what that long-term follow-up is, and what it should be. And that's part of where, we as an advocacy organization, continue to beat that drum.
Right. And I mean, there are, I don't know if it's being done now, but there are some studies that have been done, particularly in preterm infants, with long-term follow-up.
Yeah.
Much longer than 2 years, but so yes, but those have generally been in the research setting, and one of the challenges is just the funding
Absolutely
of doing that. I mean, if you look at something, this is outside of the neonatal area, but look at the women's study that's, I mean, that's just going on and on and on and on, I think out of Harvard for years and years and years. But they've managed to have the funding to continue to do that and ask some research questions, et cetera. So it's possible, but it's really tough to do.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, we've explored a lot in a short period of time. So I guess my final question as we wrap up here would be, what are some of your favorite resources that you may recommend that, families or clinicians that might be interested in getting involved more in research should look to for just knowledge, increasing their knowledge and updates of what the landscape is?
I guess I would go in two directions. I mean, one is, I mean, you mentioned, for example, the International Neonatal Consortium, which is for those that don't know, it's a project of the Critical Path Institute. And it's being driven by recognition that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in supporting the development and execution of neonatal trials. Even as simple as it might sound, like there's no standardized laboratory values. Each lab has their own, and often those are driven by pediatric and adult values. I mean, it's even just defining what the correct laboratory values are is not a trivial problem. And that may be astounding to people to think we don't even know what. Now, I don't want to overstate that. Clinicians have a good idea where they want things to be, but to define it in a research setting, to say if it's falling outside of this, that's a challenge. Even things like simple disease definitions, defining what chronic lung disease is, where you need a clear definition to be able to then study whether you've been able to move the disease off that definition. But the clinical world has been much more diverse than the ability to narrow it down. And so I guess part of it is engaging in that ongoing conversation for clinicians. And I mean, you're a member of that group, so being able to even have advocacy groups being part of that process is, I think, important. The other is to just have an understanding, I guess, of what goes on. I mean, if someone is really let's call it a regulatory geek and enjoys reading documents, I mean, the FDA has put out some very useful guidance documents. I mentioned 3 of them on informed consent, the exception from informed consent, the key information and informed consent. There's also an ethics guidance, which came out, I think, in 2022. And you can go to the FDA website and you can search guidance documents and you can see that there are guidance documents on ethics. There's also guidance documents on partial onset seizures, for example. I mean, you may find in some disease areas that you're interested in that there's actual guidance to do that. And beyond that, I would say just get engaged.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, I think if I had to rank, I'll just pick two groups. Which groups have a bigger impact on the FDA? Advocacy groups versus clinicians. Advocacy groups definitely win all the time. I think so. Be engaged, I
Yeah.
guess, would be my final plea. And yeah, be engaged.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your breadth of expertise with us today and having this conversation. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope for everyone that's been interacting and watching, whether it's live or as you're catching up on this talk, that you continue the conversation. And we're happy to and continue to bring educational resources to our community and our partners that are working hard to find the next thing for HIE. And we're, understanding this full landscape is really important, I think, for us to help our families and help out there. So that way we can continue moving forward. So again, I just want to thank you on behalf of all of us here at Hope for HIE for joining us today and everyone who's been watching.
Right. Thank you very much for the invitation.